Part 2. The meaning and symbolism behind Abernathy. There may be less to unpack when it comes to Haymitch's last name versus his first. However, it is still rich with potential foreshadowing. An obvious correlation we can make is to Ralph Abernathy, a leader in the civil rights movement. While Abernathy is not as recognizable as, say, Martin Luther King Jr. when it comes to the civil rights movement, he was equally influential. He was close friends and co-planners to many of the more influential moments during the movement, such as the Montgomery bus boycott. From what I have gathered, he may not have been the face of the movement, but he was one of the backbones to it. He helped prop up and support those who were the faces, kind of like how Haymitch was not the face of the rebellion, but helped prop up and support Katniss and Peeta, who were. Interestingly enough, Abernathy also brings us back to Scotland. The surname is a Scottish habitational name that means mouth of the river Neffy. It comes from the Pictish name of the place. Abernathy is located in the southeastern Perthshire. The name signifies a connection to the land and a heritage linked to nature and community. Side note, Pictish is derived from the Picts, who were a group during the early Middle Ages from what is now Scotland, north of the Firth of Forth. Steadily over time, the land the Picts ruled were transitioned into becoming fully Gaelicized Scots, and the Pictish identity was forgotten. Later, the idea of Picts as a tribe was revived in myth and legend. Like most Northern European people in late antiquity, the Picts were farmers living in smaller communities where cattle and horses were obvious signs of wealth and prestige. This description reminds me a little of the Seam or District 12 in general. As I had mentioned in the beginning of this part, I had less findings for Haymitch's last name. However, I am very intrigued by all the connections to Scotland. So let's dig into that with the next section. Part 3. The whole Scottish thing. During my research for possible meanings and connections to both the names Haymitch and Abernathy, I kept getting a lot of references to Scotland, which is very interesting to me because the most common connections we in the fandom have been making to Susan Collins' books have been to ancient Greece. Look at the names, for example. But we have also made connections to how the tribute system felt very reminiscent to the tale of Theseus, who defeated the Minotaur after the king of Crete had been sacrificing Athenian children to the monster for years as retribution for the death of his son. It's reminiscent of what Snow says in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Think back to what Courier says in response to Dr. Gall's question of what are the Hunger Games for? They're to punish the districts for their uprising, to commemorate the end of the war. But we also see Suzanne Collins leans into connections and inspiration from Shakespeare. So it is not a far leap for her to then jump to Scottish history and influences. After all, Shakespeare's Macbeth is a play that takes place in Scotland and dramatizes the physically violent and damaging psychological effects of political ambitions to power. Also, the play's formal name is The Tragedy of Macbeth, and as a reminder, Haymitch's story is a tragedy. It ends with him losing everything, even though he technically won the game. But there's so many smaller references linked back to Scotland, such as the hemlock berries Peeta and Katniss used at the end of Book 1. Hemlock water drop root is a poisonous plant found in Scotland that is said to have inspired the fictional poisonous fruit in the Hunger Games. The plant is also known as Dead Man's Fingers or Dead Tongue. So why is Susan Collins leaning heavily on Scottish influences when it comes to Haymitch? Scotland's culture and history is very fertile ground for Susan Collins to be inspired by. For example, look at how England had at one point outlawed Scottish culture during their time ruling over the country, making it illegal to wear tartan and kilts and even certain Christmas celebrations, to name just a few things. This type of oppression felt reminiscent to the capital. While we see in the trilogy that each district was able to maintain some distinct culture, like their different types of breads or wedding and funeral practices, they were often painted as barbaric by the capital. Or think of how the capital had made it illegal for the Coveys to perform in the Hob, afraid of it inciting a rebellion. Even Mrs. Everdeen becomes freaked out when she discovers her husband had taught a young Katniss the Hanging Tree song. There is also a similarity with the divide within colonized nations that is similar to what we see in District 12. As it is pointed out in the original trilogy, there is a divide between the merchants and the Seam. That feels reminiscent to the divide between loyalists and those who had adapted to fit with the colonizers. Those within the merchant district would still be deemed provincial to the capital, but they at least would feel more akin to them than the Seam. It's also noted that those in the Seam were treated worse off. This is something we would have seen in Scottish history. The unjust treatment to the clans that held on to their traditions, meanwhile, also the hostility towards those who threw away all the traditions to adapt to be more like the English. This is something I think we are going to see a whole lot more in the newest book to come out, Sunrise on the Reaping, especially since the book's description listed both Haymitch and Maisley Donner. But I'll get into the specifics of this and my other predictions in the next section. Another reason Susan Collins could have leaned into the Scottish influences is because it is estimated 90% of the early settlers within the Appalachian region were Anglo-Scottish. And as a reminder, District 12 is canonically placed within the Appalachian region. The argument is just where exactly, since the region covers a vast amount of states. But a big thing about Appalachia is all the misbeliefs surrounding its people. Literally from the National Library of Medicine, I found an article that shared 8 myths and misbeliefs about the region. These consist of the residents of the region are violent, the families of the regions are isolated, the culture of Appalachia is not innovative, the demographic of the region are not diverse, mountain families are impoverished, the people of the region are illiterate, the culture of the residents is defiant, the Appalachia region is backwards. All of this is not too dissimilar to the long history of anti-Scottish sentiment dating back to even the Middle Ages, such as the propaganda from William Camden's 1586 Britannia that stated, "They drink the blood of the wounds of the slain. They establish themselves by drinking one another's blood, and suppose the great number of slaughters they committed, the more honor they won." To this we add that these wild Scots had for their principal weapons bows and arrows. And to compare, let me share some of the sentiment we saw in the ballad at Song vs. Snakes regarding the districts. Everyone knew what happened if you went to the districts. You were written off, forgotten. In the eyes of the capital, you were basically dead. To be sent to the districts, even as a governor or administrator, is to be exiled from anything that matters in society. To people like Coriolanus, being sent to the districts is the equivalent of not existing at all. Or what Dr. Gall says to Coriolanus, "You don't think I invested all this time in you to hand you off to the imbeciles in the districts, do you?" There is also this quote from Coriolanus, "A girl from the districts, or at least not capital, is second-class citizen, human but bestial. Smart, perhaps, but not evolved, part of a shapeless mass of unfortunate, barbaric creatures that hovered on the periphery of his consciousness. Surely, if there had ever been an exception to the rule, it was Lucy Gray Bard." So we already have seen in the books currently published this hostility and propaganda and anti-sentiment between the capital and the districts, reminiscent of which is found towards the Appalachia and the Scots. I think we are supposed to see these similarities and recognize how ridiculous it is. To recognize that we are all the same. Or as Sejanus says in chapter 5 to the little girl at the zoo, they're kids, like you and me. But let's backtrack a little bit and look at a specific quote Susan Collins has given us about the new book, Sunrise on the Reaping. In an interview with AP, Susan Collins was quoted to say, "With Sunrise on the Reaping, I was inspired by David Hume's idea of implicit submission, and in his words, the easiness with which the many are governed by the few. The story also lent itself to a deeper dive into the use of propaganda and the power of those who control the narrative. The question, real or not real, seems more pressing to me every day." Now, you might be wondering, how does this link back to Scotland? Well, David Hume was a Scottish philosopher. One of the other things Hume argued was the inductive reasoning and belief in causality cannot be justified rationally. Instead, they result from custom and mental habit. We never actually perceive that one event causes another, but only experience the constant conjunction of events. This problem of induction means that to draw any causal inferences from past experiences, it is necessary to presuppose that the future will resemble the past. This metaphysical presumption cannot itself be grounded in prior experiences. Okay, so I will admit philosophy hurts my brain, and this is why I love Susan Collins. She makes these loftier ideas more digestible by turning them into sort of allegories. However, I will try my best to explain Hume's idea and how I connect it to the books. Say we have a jar full of balls. After sampling a few of the black ones, which taste like licorice, we might then surmise that all the black balls would taste like licorice. Here we see inductive generalization and inductive predictions. But how does this relate to what I've been talking about? Think about the ballad and Song vs. Snakes quotes I previously shared. There's an inductive generalization and predictions being applied by the capital upon the districts. This assumption they are all like that, and even Courier trying to claim Lucy is an exception to the rule, not that everyone in a district is no different than those within the capital. Or the reverse. Think of Katniss coming to realize that not all capital citizens are the same as she steadily got to know Effie and Cinna and her prep team. But these generalization and inductive reasonings help to prop up the propaganda being shared by the capital and help to keep everyone divided and unable to rise up. This is also relates to the word Susan Collins quoted, the easiness with which the many are governed by the few. So at the end of this ramble, I don't know if I can tell you exactly why Suzanne Collins was inspired by Scotland, but I also couldn't tell you why she was originally inspired by ancient Greeks and Romans and by Shakespeare plays. It is a little easier to see why she was inspired by the philosophers she used throughout her books, but why Scotland? I guarantee there is someone out there way more qualified than me in my poor research who might be able to give a stronger connection between the Hunger Games and Scotland. But I think if I had to give some form of an answer, I think it is because of the dynamics between Scotland and England throughout history mirrors what she is trying to show us. For 4 books now, Susan Collins has been showing us how utterly ridiculous the divide between the people in Panem are, the divide between the capital and the districts, between the merchants and the seam. As we have read the series, all of us have recognized how silly these divides are, because at the end of the day, they are all humans who deserve the same rights and freedoms. And well, look at Scotland and England. They are obviously very distinct. They have their own language and slang and traditions and history and cultures, yet outside the two countries, the rest of the world sometimes wrongly lump them together. So, to the rest of the world, the anti Scottish sentiment, for example, seemed insane because on the outside and even deeper down at the core, they had more similarities than differences. And yet, as humans, we continue to have this need to find some reason to be better than someone else, to find some group of people for us to step on and claim we are superior to. And at the end of the day, it is absolutely ridiculous. So I think there is a possibility Suzanne Collins might lean more into this in her next book, which leads me into my next part, the potential foreshadowing for Sunrise on the Reaping. Well, I'm back to dig into yet another name from the Hunger Games and what the meanings behind it can show us. I'll link down below my video where I dug into Gale and Peeta's last names and how the meanings behind them kind of foreshadowed these characters, but also revealed a lot about them. Now, this particular one was inspired by a TikTok video I had come across where this creator was talking about Haymitch and the new book to come out, Sunrise on the Reapings. In her video, she mentioned how we always knew President Snow's first name was Coriolanus, but it wasn't until Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes that we realized how much foreshadowing existed behind his name. So in this video, I am going to be digging into Haymitch's name to see if I can uncover anything that might hint to what's to come in the Sunrise on the Reaping. Before I get started, I want to share how I'm breaking this video down since it will be a little different than my last one. Here I will be looking into the possible meaning behind the name Haymitch, then do the same with his last name Abernathy. Afterwards, I have a few broader connections I would like to make before digging into what this could mean with the next book in the series. And as a reminder, the intent of this video is to share everything I have found and the handful of connections I made. Going back to when I had to do my undergraduate thesis, correlation does not mean causation. Everything I share here is not the end-all be-all. Some of the things I suggest might seem strange and connection is weak. However, my hope is to share the connections I did make and to encourage others to use them as jumping off boards to form your own connections and theories. That being said, let's get started. Part 1. The meaning and symbolism behind Haymitch. Similar to Peeta and even Peeta's last name, Malark, Haymitch does not appear to be a real name. although it seems it is now. Apparently, parents have been naming their babies after Susan Collins characters, but because Haymitch is technically not a real name, not like, say, Coriolanus, I had to approach this from a different angle. First, I want to break his name down into its parts, into Hay and then Mitch. Immediately, Hay feels more fitting to be a part of someone's name in District 11, the agriculture district, than District 12, the coal district. Although, who knows, we might learn something about Haymitch's heritage in the newest book. Still, the most obvious association with hay has to do with agriculture and being used to feed for animals. This could be in reference to how Haymitch and the many other children of Panem were merely the food to sustain the capital's control. Their forced participation in the games, their forced sacrifice, is to prop up the capital's propaganda, because at the end of the day, the vast majority of them became nameless and faceless. We see it with how Katniss describes past tributes by a singular action but rarely their names. Her comment to Plutarch summarizes this even better. The tributes were necessary to the games too, until they weren't, and then they were very disposable. Hay is abundant, just as the number of children who have gone through 74 years of Hunger Games, just as the number of children holding their breaths each year to hear if they will be reaped. And the term reap is more commonly associated with farming, with cutting and gathering crops. But yet, Haymitch does not become totally nameless and faceless. He survives past his games and continues to survive the next 24 years of mentoring. All the while, he is well known, in part because he is the sole living District 12 victor, but also with the connections we saw he has made with Plutarch and the other victors during Catching Fire. Haymitch exceeds expectations with simultaneously encouraging others to underestimate him with his drunken behavior, which, side note, is very obviously a coping mechanism, but I also believe he uses it to his advantage. I believe he purposely made a scene falling off the stage when Katniss first volunteers to give her that much needed moment to compose herself. But let's move on to other possible things hay could symbolize. In many works, hay could be used to symbolize materiality in the sin of averse, or the extreme greed for wealth or material gain. This is trickier because, as far as we have seen in the original trilogy, Haymitch does not desire material goods. He couldn't care less with the wealth surrounding him. He solely uses it to support the Hob and to buy alcohol. However, we do not know just yet if maybe in Sunrise on the Reaping, this pre-game Haymitch is maybe envious of those who have more. In the Bible and other texts, hay is used to symbolize the fleeting nature of things, which feels similar to this expression, make hay while the sun shines. The expression means to make the most of an opportunity. This feels like Haymitch. Haymitch has survived as long as he has because he is very good at seizing opportunities. From the way he has won his games by banking on his knowledge of the force field to the choices he made in regards to Katniss and Peeta. Because of this, I am very intrigued to see if this is an aspect of him will be highlighted more in Sunrise on the Reaping. Before switching over to look into the meaning and symbolism behind Mitch, there's one last reference I have for Hay, the Clan Hay. Clan Hay is a Scottish clan of the Grampian region of Scotland. I'm terribly sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Clan Hay were influential in the politics and history of the region, including many of Scotland's wars for independence, dating all the way back to the 1400s. The clan also was instrumental in the founding and shaping of America. So let's look a little deeper into this family. Clan Hay's crest is a belt made into a circlet, and in its center is a coronet, or crown, with a falcon armed, just and belled. Now, just and belled is in reference to the leather straps around falcons' legs and the bells on that, which is a common practice when using falcons for hunting. And immediately I started making connections with this crest to the Hunger Games. For example, the coronet could represent the capital. Coronets usually represent royalty, aka those in power ruling. And it looks like the falcon is tied up with or attached to the coronet. But the victors are also given a coronet by President Snow during the whole ceremony following the end of the games. So could the falcon, this wild predator, be Haymitch? now just embelled by the capital. Meanwhile, the crest is designed to look like a belt cinching. Is that the capital coiling tighter and tighter around him like the snake it is? Or that Haymitch and Clan Hay are those who will help to loosen that belt once more? Maybe the belt's meaning might become more apparent with Clan Hay's motto, Serva Jogum. The motto translates to keep the yoke, which harks back to those early farmers who led the clan to victory. But the term yoke can also be found in the Bible in reference to the yoke of Christ, which allows people to understand the burdens of life, such as sorrow, misfortune, disease, or morality. So the belt could be in reference to the yoke from their motto. Still, let's put a pin in this because I would like to dig more into the Scottish references at a later point and instead move on to the second half of Haymitch's name. There's not as much to unpack with Mitch. There's this use of Mitch as a British slang meaning to play truant from school or ditches school, but this very likely is derived from the Old French words mouchia or moussier, which means to hide or to lurk, which I could backbend into a connection with Haymitch. When we first meet Haymitch, he dismisses his new tributes, ditching his responsibility as their mentor after many, many years of watching his tributes die in the arenas. However, we can infer that he has been partially hiding or lurking based on his interactions with Plutarch and the other victors and the few bits of dialogue we get from him that the rebellion has been brewing for longer than Katniss has been aware of. While being a disinterested drunk, he has made him callous and pessimistic towards the kids he is meant to mentor. It does seem like he was simultaneously making himself less threatening to the capital after what they did to him years ago in order to stick it to them later. Though, we do need to also acknowledge that this image of Haymitch projected was not entirely intentional. He was generally using alcohol to cope, and his detox was painful, as we saw in Catching Fire. But he sees the opportunity, going back to one of the meanings for hay, and used his flaw to his benefit. That was the only Mitch connection I could find, but Mitch could be a shortened version of Mitchell. And interesting enough, there is a mountain in North Carolina named Mount Mitchell. The mountain is not only the highest peak in the eastern United States, but its location is interesting because we know District 12 is located within the Appalachian Mountain Range, and many believe District 12 is located more specifically in North Carolina. At the very least, District 12 for the original trilogy was filmed in North Carolina. Mitch could also be a shortened version of Michael, and Michael is a common name used for heroic warriors in Irish folklore, kind of like the name Hamish in Scottish folklore, which leads me to my next interpretation. It is very likely that Haymitch might be inspired by the names Hamish. Roughly, they sound similar. The name Hamish gained popularity in Scotland during the medieval period. Remember Clan Hayes of Scotland during my breakdown on the prefix Hay? During this time, Hamish signified a supplanter or one who takes the place of another. Historically, Hamish appeared in various forms throughout Scottish history. It could be found among noble families such as Clan Campbell, where it symbolized their privileged status and connections to the Scottish nobility. In addition, the name Hamish would often feature among warriors and fighters who defended Scotland during conflicts with neighboring nations. This reflected the meaning of the name as a supplanter or one who overcomes obstacles in their path. The name grew in popularity thanks to popular authors like William Black and Sir Walter Scott during the Romantic era, the era of writing and philosophy that influenced Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. The name grew in popularity mostly due to William Black using it for his characters, and he was very popular during this time, leading to bootleg copies of his works being sold in America, which nearly ruined his career. Though there were some critiques that his works focused too much on hunting and fishing, but the important detail to take away from William Black is that he used to be a war correspondent during the Austro-Prussian War, and a commonality between most of his works is that they were tragedies. Both details instantly made me think of the Hunger Games, but more so the tragedy portion, because technically Sunrise on the Reaping will be a tragedy, since we already know what happens to Haymitch's loved ones after winning the games thanks to what he reveals to Katniss and Peeta. Meanwhile, Sir William Scott can also be attributed to popularizing the name. This man influenced many, many famous authors. He influenced the likes of Mark Twain, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the Brontes, Jane Austen, Victor Hugo, Mary Shelley, George Eliot, Edgar Allan Poe, and Henry James, just to name a few. But besides being a novelist and a poet, Sir Walter Scott was a historian who is credited for the reinvention of the Scottish culture. His works contained a strong focus on Scottish history and identity, the clash between tradition and modernity, the romanticization of the past, the loyalty, courage, the complexities of class, and a belief in tolerance across social divisions. Hint, hint, another reference to Scotland. Unfortunately, you will have to wait a little bit longer because before I get into the theories regarding Scotland, for next we are going to dig into Haymitch's last name, Abernathy. Part 4, the potential foreshadowing for Sunrise on the Reaping. Here's the thing. I don't think I could have ever truly predicted what Susan Collins will do next. I never could have predicted how Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes would be a story that has readers questioning their opinions on President Snow and seeing how fear and superiority created this version of the Hunger Games we are more familiar with. I adamantly believe Susan Collins would never listen to fans demanding books on Phoenix and Haymitch's games because to me it showed they missed the point of the book. That by demanding their games, it felt like to me the Capitol demanding for more games and going to old arenas for vacation destinations to recreate moments. However, I am partially eating my own words as Susan Collins announced Sunrise on the Reaping, Haymitch's games. But I say partially because I personally think Collins will not spend as much time on the games as people think or want. At the very least, I hope they will not miss the whole reason why Susan Collins is writing this story in the first place, to tell us a greater message that she feels needs to be told, in this case, the use and harm of propaganda. I honestly could dig forever into what I think she might be intending to do with that theme, but I think I might wait until I've read the book to do that. For now, I'm going to be focusing on what Haymitch's name could be foreshadowing for Sunrise on the Reaping. And as a reminder, the idea of this video stemmed from a TikTok video I stumbled upon, where the creator pointed out how we always knew President Snow's first name was Coriolanus. However, we did not realize all the potential foreshadowing his name held until we got Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So what potential foreshadowing could Haymitch's name have for his book? To start, let's look back to part 1 and my initial breakdown of Haymitch's first name. When you break his name down into its parts, you get hay, like the plant you grow and later cut down, or reap. Which then you can connect that red thread to the title of the newest book, Sunrise on the Reaping. There are so many ways one can interpret this title. For one, the reaping in the Hunger Games universe is the day 2 kids from each district are chosen to be tributes for this year's game. So the title could be the meaning that we are at the dawn or the start of the worst day of every district kid's life. But the reaping from the title could also be in reference to Haymitch. Hay, reap, reaping, and how his presence is the start of the capital's tyrannical downfall. It might have taken another 25 years before they do fall, but one could argue it started the year of Haymitch's games. The year he showed the limits of the capital, the year he exposed the man behind the curtain, momentarily destroying the illusion of the game by exposing the hands of the game maker, the year he used the capital's product against them in a very similar way the Mockingjays were. And then they made him even stronger of an opponent because he not only used them to win, he won against double the tributes. Haymitch's actions during this game could be the spark to show others that the capital is cruel and valuable. His spark is what helps to allow Katniss and Peeta's berries to ignite the bonfire that takes the whole system down. But let's revisit Haymitch's name. As I have previously pointed out, it is very possible that Haymitch is an alternative spelling and pronunciation to the name Haymitch, just as Cersei in Game of Thrones is an alternative spelling to Circe from Greek mythology. During the medieval period, Haymitch signified a supplanter or one who takes the place of another. Will this play a role in his story? I do not think he will volunteer in someone else's place, since they made a huge deal about Katniss doing it. However, perhaps he volunteers for someone else in a different way, maybe by putting his name in more than his sister in order for them to still get the Tesseract. Or maybe he takes someone's place during the games. Because we need to remember that the theme of this book is about propaganda. So from that and what David Levithan, I probably am pronouncing his last name wrong, but he's the Scholastic editorial director. He says that everything you thought you knew about the second quarter qualm, well, you didn't really know any of it. We can assume that the version that Katniss and Peeta watched in Catching Fire was heavily edited then. Again, I cannot tell you specifically how this clue might manifest in the book, but it's something to maybe keep in mind when we finally can read it. Moving on, let's look back at his last name, Abernathy. The last name is an old Scottish one that signified a connection to the land and a heritage linked to nature and community. If we look back on the rest of the books, you'll notice that nature continues to play a heavy role in the story. We got to see polarizing emotions towards nature from Katniss and Snow. One felt comfort being within it, while the other was more afraid to have his back to the woods than if he were to have his back to the angry mob before him. So I think the book will continue with the nature theme and even lean harder into it. For one, the little we do know about Haymitch's games, the arena was described as being like a natural utopia. It was exceptionally beautiful and serene, far lovelier than other arenas used. But the twist was that everything within the arena was dangerous and poisonous, that the only food and water you could completely trust was any that came from the cornucopia. This literally manifests Snow's belief that you can't trust nature, but you should trust the capital. It encourages the viewers to continue their dependency on the capital in order to survive. Though, going back to the last name, Abernathy, and its meaning, I think we could see a similar relationship between nature and Haymitch as we saw with Katniss, or at the very least, someone close to Haymitch, like his sister perhaps, or maybe we might get an opportunity to see Katniss's father through Haymitch's eyes. And we already know Katniss's father was the one to teach her how to hunt and gather. But maybe Haymitch does not have a connection to nature yet. Maybe he is an angry teenage boy who blames every failure and hardship on the capital. Rightly so, but still, maybe he already is too cynical to try to sneak around and supply what's lacking like Katniss's father. Especially since we learned from both Haymitch and Katniss's mother that the peacekeepers during this time were extremely strict. And I feel like I can almost safely guess Haymitch will be an angry teenage boy, even before Snow destroyed his life, based on what Katniss described his interview style as while watching previous games during Catching Fire. When Haymitch was interviewed, Caesar asked, "So Haymitch, what do you think about the Hunger Games having 100% more competitors than usual?" Haymitch responded, "Well, they'll still be 100% stupid as usual, so I figured that my odds will be roughly the same," making the audience laugh. With that, I think we can assume that there already was a cynicism to him and a strong dislike towards the capital and the games. And this links back to the whole Scottish thing I talked about earlier. As I had mentioned in that section, I wonder if we might see the divide between the people, not just Capital and District 12, which I think we will see while in Haymitch's head, but also between the seam and merchant class. Especially since a part of the book synopsis mentioned the most stuck-up girl in town, potentially hinting to Maisley Donner, who was a merchant girl, a friend to Katniss's mother, and the aunt of the mayor's daughter. Remember the girl who gave Katniss her Mockingjay pin? So I wonder if we will see Haymitch's hatred towards the capital bleeding into those of the merchant class, just as there is a divide within colonized nations between those who are truly loyal to their country and culture and those who adapted to be the lapdogs of the colonizers, just as was seen throughout the Scottish history while ruled by England. Let's also not forget that the capital is purposely trying to create animosity between even those within their own district to then prevent them from coming together to form an uprising. And that's where I think the propaganda element could come in. With a heavy peacekeeper present, I wonder if we would see more capital propaganda to keep the two sections of District 12 divided. It would also explain why it was treated like such a big deal that Katniss's mother married Katniss's father. As I had mentioned in the beginning of the section, I feel like I am wandering around in the dark when it comes to theorizing what could happen in Sunrise on the Reaping. However, based on all this, I feel like there is a potential we will see a cynical version of Haymitch who is angry at the capital. While it might seem strange because it doesn't sound too different from the adult Haymitch we met, I think it will be done in a similar way to Snow. In the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, we saw that Snow pretty much always had a superiority complex, and his childhood had created this pre-existing fear and animosity towards the districts. But it was the events we watched unfurl during the book that solidified his beliefs and hardened his personality into what we later saw in the original trilogy. I think we will see the same thing with Haymitch. He will already be cynical and angry, But then it will become worse because his experiences during the games and falling will prove his beliefs. And for example, I think it would also prove and show to him the propaganda and how much he's been taking in the Capitol's propaganda, and realize that his hatred towards others, such as the merchant class, is unfounded when you compare it to the Capitol. That being said, I am still so excited to see exactly what Susan Collins will do, because I know she will exceed even my wildest expectations, and I look forward to picking it apart as I have done with every other book in the series. If you have stuck around for this long, thank you so much. Like I said in the beginning, this was more of a rambling video, a place to share all the little nuggets of ideas and theories I'd come across while digging into Haymitch's name. Mostly because I'm like a little kid who likes to overturn every rock I see, to then see what kind of bugs lie underneath. But I previously mentioned I hope that this video can be a good springboard for others to fall down their own rabbit holes and form their own opinions and theories. So, what do you think Haymitch's name could potentially foreshadow? And what do you think Susan Collins might do in this next book? Please share in the comments, because I love hearing any and all thoughts and opinions and theories when it comes to this series. And once again, thank you for listening and watching.